Welcome, Bobby. Welcome, everyone. So my name is Hamish Rogers. I am a sport development consultant with Sport New Zealand. Today, we're doing a Q&A with Bobby Newport, lecturer at North Tec in Sport and Recreation. I'm going to throw it over to you, Bobby, have a little bit of a chat about yourself and tell us a little bit about your background, probably leading us towards how you arrived at the research that's really going to form the crux of our conversation today.
Cool. Well, thanks for that, Hamish. And thanks for having me on as well. It's, I guess, quite a pleasure to be invited along to talk about these things. We will talk about what I've done as we get into things. But what's really important, I think, when you do any research is understanding who the researcher is. So my background, as Hamish alluded to before, I've obviously got 2 young kids myself. Both of them are currently at home watching The Lion King while I do this interview. So yeah, quite fitting, I suppose. Previous to that, my background earlier, I grew up in a rural community myself. So I'm from a farming community in the far north. Grew up rurally, played lots of sports growing up, sampled quite a few different things, rugby, hockey, basketball, volleyball, whatever I could really get my hands on, and sailing, those sorts of things as well. I was very lucky to be able to do those sorts of things and had lots of family support to be able to do those sorts of things. That was my background, or where I've sort of come from. I've now traveled a bit around the world and done a few things, as you do, before the world sort of shut down. But now I've been back here in Whangarei, settled with my wonderful wife and 2 children, and have been teaching at North Tec in their sport and rec department for the last, this is probably my 14th year, I think it is there. So yeah, I've been there a while. The areas I teach, or primarily teach, tend to be around things like skill acquisition and that learning and skill development space. So those 2 areas sort of directed me or led me towards my thinking with this research. Growing up in that rural space, that sort of unique experience that you have in those rural space. We are quite a rural country here in New Zealand as well, but also a real interest in that early development and what happens in those early years that feed into our overall development, that fundamental stuff, the building blocks, and how that then helps us later on in life. So yeah, in a nutshell, that's probably what brought me to this topic as an area of interest. Having my own kids as well, there's a real interest in sort of watching them grow and develop, and the sorts of activities they get up to, and the play and the sport that they do. So yeah, does that answer the question about where I kind of came to get to this?
Yeah, and just to clarify for the audience, so last year, 2 years ago, you submitted your, correct me if I'm wrong, your master's thesis, and you were able to publish research last year, or came out early this year. And really, your master's thesis was looking at the athlete development journeys of some of New Zealand's elite hockey players who are from rural and regional backgrounds.
In essence, that's what we did. So I did my master's thesis. I think I completed it in 2019. So it is a couple of years ago now as to when that was finished. And then, yes, the journal article, fortunately, has been published early this year, January. It just came out. But yeah, that was the topic, or the focus area, was to look at those athletes in that rural and regional area and what were their early experiences and how that fed into their pathway of development. The initial focal point was those early years. So what was going on sort of primarily between the ages of 6 and 12, because that's been identified as a space where lots of really important developmental stuff's going on. But ultimately, through the course of the research, it ended up being the athletes telling me about their pathway all the way through, from early on right through to when they became a black stick, for example. That sort of illustrates some of those inseparable notions of those early experiences and how they feed into everything that you do as you go through. Reasons or background or why we looked at those rural and regional athletes was, one, what I've already alluded to with my own experiences and reasons for choosing to do this research, but also there's a bit of global evidence around smaller communities and the unique experience that happens in those smaller communities and how that is beneficial or helps an athlete's pathway. There's obviously lots of challenges that come with smaller communities as well, but how those things potentially contribute to an athlete's development. So that was there. And then to justify the choice of hockey as a sport, it wasn't just, let's just choose hockey because I like hockey. There was a bit of thinking that goes into that as well. Primarily, it was around that for New Zealand hockey. We've been involved in it for a very long time. We've got top teams and world champs in Olympics, Commonwealth Games. It's a global sport where we've been ranked in the top 8 for a long time. So we're up there in that field of hockey, both men and women. But also it doesn't tend to suffer those kind of gender stereotypes. So lots of boys and girls both play hockey, and it's a team invasion sport, which is to an extent sort of could be at the heart of New Zealand psyche with things like rugby and netball and all these big team sports. But also, and probably what links into some of the research, is hockey doesn't tend to be a sport that's predisposed to having to specialise really early or to sample sports earlier on. So those were the reasons for choosing to focus on hockey and looking at those rural and regional experiences.
Awesome. I'm keen to take one step back to the conversation around smaller communities and use it as a juncture just to hone in on some of the things you discussed in your research. We don't need to just limit the conversation to your research, but some of the observations that you might have overall. So in terms of smaller communities, we're talking about effectively regional and rural communities. Is there any other way, before we continue to go down this path, that you'd want to define?
Yeah, you'll note in the title of the journal article that around the regional and rural, the use of both those words. And if you ever try to define rural globally, it's quite a tricky word to define, which feeds into what we do. So to quantify that or characterize that, is it comes back to the things that happen in those smaller communities as well. So it's the term smaller communities is probably a better way of describing it, because although in this country, as I say, we're quite a rural country by and large, our urban centres by global standards are still fairly small as well. So when you're trying to do comparative stuff between our research and stuff across the globe, trying to categorise what a rural or small community is becomes quite tricky. So I suppose for the listeners, and to give you a bit of an idea, that the athletes that were interviewed ranged from sort of really, really rural. So you've got athletes that are on a farm in the middle of nowhere, in the sticks, so to speak, or way out in the middle of nowhere, ranging through to athletes that are from more satellite urban centres that are a smaller area, but not as far away from a bigger centre.
So going into this rural, smaller community area, you alluded to it in your research that there tends to be some evidence, or whether it's anecdotal or otherwise, a lot of elite athletes, and perhaps it's like a per capita conversation, but there are a lot of elite athletes that tend to come out of these kind of cities. Why do you think that is?
I can only really talk to my experience. I don't see myself as an absolute expert in any of these things. I can talk to the experience of what I had when talking to these athletes. But by and large, when you read the literature and when you look at those sorts of things and the findings that came out of my research as well, the characteristics that tend to start to come out is that community support, an environment where kids or youth can roam freely, where people are looking out for each other, where there's that wraparound notion that comes with those smaller communities. Tends to be a lot more outdoor play, risky play, real play, those sorts of things that tend to happen in those smaller communities. Farming communities, there's those elements of responsibility that come with being a child growing up on a farm, go move the stock or look after the animals. It tends to be a lot more youth-led sort of stuff. So the kids lead the sport. They play the unstructured muck around stuff down at the court, whatever standard that court's in, but they go and shoot some hoops or whatever. Those sorts of characteristics tend to be what you sort of see. If you look at some of the global literature as well around the standards and the challenges of those rural communities and what access they have to facilities, and there's those notions of, by and large, you've got lots of access because the community looks after you, but what standard are those facilities at? And does that feed into your development, having to, I guess, adapt to and be more variable and work within those more challenging spaces?
Thanks, Bobby. There's a couple of things I hear from rural communities. So wraparound support, the freedom to roam, which is a point I'm keen to circle back and talk about. More risky play. There's a sense that the environment predisposes, particularly young people growing up, to a whole heap of factors that aren't necessarily manufactured on purpose. It's not like people are like, let's create these factors because they're good for development, but they just happen to be there, and as a consequence, there's all these positive benefits. There'll be a second question I'll follow up in a second, which is, well, for parents in urban settings, are there any lessons that they can learn, or is there any way that they can manufacture some of these environmental considerations, or is there anything parents perhaps just need to be mindful of, because in an urban setting, you don't get predisposed to some of these contexts and some of these environmental factors. But hold on that, let's go back to the risky play and the roaming. I thought there was a neat quote in your research where one of the participants that you interviewed talked about how they knew everyone within a 20-kilometre block, so 10 k's out and 10 k's back. And within the same passage, it talked about at a very young age, participants' parents were quite happy for them to go off and roam down to the forest and just be able to play by themselves, with the constraints around, well, you need to be in like a big group. I like this notion of the right to roam almost. Are you able to just elaborate on that a little bit and some of the observations you might have had?
Yes, I suppose I can probably come at that one from a couple of different angles. The first one, to elaborate a little bit on what you've alluded to, there's quite a theme from the participants that they had that ability to roam, and there was that real safety net or community support around that, which to in essence, and when you talk about as a parent, it's a big decision to let your kids just go and do their thing or not. So you're not supervising or you're not actually seeing what they do. And that's not easy. So to come at that from another angle as a parent myself, I'm doing this research, but at the same time, I've got a 10-year-old and a 7-year-old, and it's not easy to let your kids go and sort of play in a risky environment, because as all parents, we just want the best for our kids, don't we? We want them to be safe. We want them to be okay. Where I come back to is the developmental stuff that happens in those spaces. Like, it's really incredible what kids will get up to from a positive perspective when parents aren't watching. And some of those things that get talked about is the positive development, the learning that comes from that, having to be responsible at a young age. Some of the other subjects talked about being the older sibling and being responsible for their younger siblings. How does that benefit somebody to have to start to think about some of that responsibility in that space? Working with others or going in a group, as you say, tended to be a theme as well, and that's looking out for each other and working together in those relationships, and which tended to be quite an important thing as well. If we're talking about that topic of roaming and responsibility, I always just come back to the benefits that potentially come out of that. How do you develop to be very mature or responsible and make good risky decisions, or good decisions around risk, if you like, sorry to use the terminology. Yeah, how do you learn those things? And what better way to learn those things than to actually go out and do it without somebody there holding your hand, telling you what to do.
So let's circle back to the question that I planted but didn't let you get towards, contrasting the rural and urban environments. Is there a feeling that rural environments are safer to enable this play than urban environments? I'm wondering if in today's day and age, the sense of enabling or allowing young children to roam and do risky play is more prevalent in rural environments than urban environments. And just to backdrop that, I have a lot of conversation with colleagues at the moment around the sense that there's more control from parents in terms of preventing risky play in today's day and age. And actually, one of the consequences people are seeing is physical literacy in terms of the young people's capabilities to just do perhaps not basic movements, but let's call them different types of movements, throwing balls, running, landing, jumping, falling. When you talk to the likes of PE teachers and coaches, it has diminished compared to years gone by for cohorts in the same age bracket. Back to the contrasting of the rural versus urban question first. Do you believe, whether it's culturally or just the environment, rural environments are safer to allow that? Or is there something else going on?
Yeah, so it's an interesting one, because I've talked about this with my colleagues and others at length as well around those sorts of things. One thing, the person and the environment are inseparable in the sense that, I mean, if you've got kids in an urban environment, the things that surround them and the things they learn are associated with what's around them. If they're out there, they get a bit street smart. They're used to lots of cars being around, that sort of thing. Whereas kids in a rural environment, they're in an environment that's different to that. So they sort of potentially learn around that environment. Something that's come up in discussions I've had with other people is that community sense and the changes or the shifts that might be happening in that. Is it linked to a transient population? Is it linked to the housing stuff? Is there a notion that in the more rural environments, for example, Mr. Brown lives in the house down the road. Mr. Brown's lived in the house down the road for the last 40 years. He's still there, and you know them. Everyone knows their neighbours, therefore they trust their neighbours, therefore they let their kids roam. Is there an element of that? Whereas maybe in our more urban settings, there's a lot of renting, there's a lot of transients, there's a lot of changing faces, and therefore we don't know who lives next door. Does that affect things? Those sorts of things potentially contribute. As I say, I don't know the answers, but I would probably say there's an element of allowing those things a little bit more in the rural environments. And that might just be because there's more space, there's less people around, there's less chance for, I don't know, it's something to go wrong that involves other people or cars or things like that happening. Maybe there's an element of the child being able to have control of their environment a little bit more because it's them with the environment. But yeah, I don't really know the answer in that space, because I mean, there's no real reason why in an urban environment the kids can't learn to survive and do things appropriately in that space. Do you know what I mean?
So for parents, well, the young people and kids in rural environments, they're being brought up in an environment, and by the sounds of it, for a host of reasons, that environment's conducive to enabling, by contrast, more roaming, more risky play. Is there something that parents in urban environments can either learn from that, or just need to be aware of? And I need to make sure the audience realizes I'm not trying to paint parents with a broad brush. I appreciate this is on a spectrum, and there'll be a host of different parenting styles. Is there anything that parents should be mindful of, particularly those urban environments, around thinking about how do I support or enable my child to roam and have access to risky play because of the benefits we've talked about?
Probably one thing to start with, and again, I'm completely in the same space as you, Hamish. As a parent myself, it's a really challenging space, and there's no one right way to do things. We all have our own experiences, we all have our own environment, we all have all those things that come with it. So I suppose just to speak to the sort of research that I have been immersed in recently, is the community thing's probably a big thing. So I guess one of those associations with that rural environment is that everybody knows each other and everyone supports each other, which allows that more conducive environment for kids to go and play together and have that risky stuff happening without the parents stressing about being a helicopter or being there all the time. And there's no reason why that can't happen in urban environments. Like, that community notion, your local community within the urban environment. I mean, we live in a really fast-paced world, and it's challenging for people. Two working parents, all those sorts of things are hard and challenging, and trying to find the right thing for your kids is a really challenging thing as well, because every kid is different too. We've got to keep that in mind. But probably the community thing is a big element. So getting to know your neighbours, actually knowing each other, supporting each other, and working together to try and help your kids have those awesome experiences.
Yeah, I can see that now. It's interesting. It's not something I've explicitly thought about, but the sense of connection, as you said before, forms the social fabric to create the safety net. And to your point, because of transients or a host of other factors, perhaps that hasn't been as present in urban environments. But tactically, if parents are aware of this and can play the long game and think about, well, how do I become more connected in my environment so it's safer for my child to be able to go in and have these experiences.
I was just going to add that notion of village raising the child, I suppose, is probably a big thing to throw in there. And it's the same with the school environment. One of those big themes that came out of what I was investigating is around the support and actually being able to be involved. I'm not saying you need to be a helicopter or a lawnmower, and we can explore those terms a little bit more, because you've got to allow your kids to have some autonomy and make the decisions. But just actually being around and caring about what's going on seems to be quite an important factor. And there's obviously challenges with that too. And something probably just to throw in there is, when you think about the people that I was talking to with these athletes, a lot of them are from farming families. And if you think about farming families, quite often there'd be one working parent. So there was always a parent that was able to go and take their kid to sport or be involved or have something to do with the sport. There was also that element of having the freedom or the time, even because you're self-employed as a farmer, whereas I'm completely aware that different employment opportunities are quite different as well in those other spaces where you might not have the time or ability to do some of those things.
Yeah, and I think that's a fair observation when you contrast the people in these different environments. Can you segue a little bit, and hopefully it'll use this as a bit of a segue back into your research, although I know this question isn't exactly part of your research, but an observation that we're seeing in the urban environments for a host of reasons: density of housing, less roaming, less play happening, and parents, for a lot of reasons, the physical activity of young people is decreasing. But one of the consequences is young people at an earlier age in particular, but young people being programmed more. I'm reflecting on my own experience here. So my mum used to have a rule, which basically we weren't allowed inside until the sun came down. And it was like get outside. And especially like during a weekend, it was like literally the doors would get open, we get booted out, and then she would lock the doors. Whereas now, and again, I'm using generalizations to make a point, but as anecdotally, myself and what colleagues are saying as parents are programming, not necessarily themselves, but putting the young people into programs. So whether it's a program run by a club or by a for-profit entity or a commercial entity or something at the YMCA or say at the school, et cetera, and with this programming comes, I guess, a more formal type of activity, which there are benefits to. But if all you're getting is like a formal, very structured type of activity, as we'll talk about in a little bit, there are some opportunity costs to just having that type of activity. My first question probably is this an observation that is also happening in rural environments, or do you think it's just unique to urban environments?
Oh, geez, I mean, I can speak to the observation from what I got from my research, in the sense that it was more child driven in those smaller rural environments. I like the words you use, put into a program, like the parents putting them into it rather than the child choosing to go and do it. And there's a lot to be said around that as well. And when we talk about these notions, the psychological notions around autonomy and sort of self-awareness and choosing what you do and having confidence in those things, and do by putting people into formal programs, are those things that we're taking away a little bit. But as you say, they're really good things as well. Like, I think what we have to remember with all of this stuff is that play and sport and all those things, they're not mutually exclusive. They're all really valuable in their own way, but it's not one or the other. In fact, both and all should be quite important. If we're going to come back to that idea of play and sport is, I mean, yeah, they're inseparable, like play and sport. How do we define those terms? I mean, that's the first question, isn't it? They're quite tricky to define in themselves. Muck around sport versus formalized sport, they're both really valuable. So, yeah, I suppose to answer your question, it's hard to say, but from the research, it tended to be that there wasn't so much of them being put into the formal programs in those smaller communities. It was more around them having autonomy or choosing to go and play with their mates rather than being put into a program.
And I need to caveat that where the parents are doing it for good reasons. I think there's probably an observation that the environment in urban settings is becoming less conducive to enable risky play and activity in general. So some parents are feeling compelled to, well, I need to find some way of supporting my children to be active, and this is an outlet. To circle back to your observation of the play versus sport conversation, let's hone in on that a little bit, because I think actually unpacking those definitions, I know they're pretty hard to define, but I think that's probably a useful conversation for parents to try and think about, and in the sense I think about the informal to formal spectrum of activity as well. I know you had a diagram, maybe you want to share that, and then and we can talk about this and probably come at it from a couple of different approaches. Happy to be steered by you, but I'll let you share that diagram.
This diagram is one that sort of drew itself through the research that I did. So what it illustrates is the play and the sports experiences of these athletes. So when I went into the research, there was 3 overarching areas that I wanted to discuss with these guys. I wanted to find out what their early play experiences were like. I wanted to find out what their early sport experiences were like. And then I also wanted to find out about the people around them during these experiences. And what really quickly becomes clear is the inseparable notion or inseparable nature of these things. So the sports experiences and the play experiences overlap quite a bit. I mean, something that I did with the subjects before we started is I got a bit of an insight from them as to how they would define those two terms. What did play look like versus what did sport look like? And as you said, Hamish, you end up with that spectrum of sports with the more formalized, competitive, organized, structured stuff. Play tends to be a little bit more for the child's own sake, their own unstructured sorts of things. But again, play ranges from your notions of risky play through to deliberate, unstructured models of sport. And the athletes spoke to a lot of those different things. But what this picture also illustrates is the people, which we've talked about quite a bit already in this discussion. The people are the ones around these guys that facilitate these spaces and support or don't support those sorts of things to happen, if you like. And so the sports experiences and the play experiences happen within a conducive or supportive environment from the people around them. Does that explain that picture a little bit around those two different things?
Yeah, I think that's really useful. There's 2 things I'm focusing on is where the circles overlap of the sports and play experiences. I'm picturing myself as a kid going away to tournaments, but all the play that actually happened in those tournaments with my teammates outside of the games, and whether that play was actually like kick around or keepy uppies or tiggy and the like. And I think probably where I'm going with this is actually thinking about the people, so whether it be coaches or parents in particular, and perhaps it's some administrators, what are some of the key things that, 1, they need to be mindful of, and 2, how it has helped looking at this and thinking about this? How will it help them in their roles in terms of supporting better quality experiences for young people?
Yeah, I'll probably put my Skillet hat on a little bit with this too, the coaching frame, and that notion that play is hugely beneficial in so many different ways. I think one thing to really remember is that play and sport, the more formalized, organized stuff and the more unstructured muck around stuff are both really, really valuable. And so one shouldn't really be replaced by the other. In the sense we should be encouraging as much as we can of both. And if you look at current coaching models around TGFU or constraints-led theory around lots of discovery and problem solving and play, there in itself is some of the approaches that we should be thinking about and the way that our athletes learn. I mean, in its simplest form, when you look at some of the literature around play, think about the benefits that happen for an athlete when they can muck around and make up their own version of the game in, say, a similar environment to where they would play the formalized game, but without the pressure, without the stress, and without the observation of the coach. Like, what developmental stuff can happen there? It's amazing. They try things they might not try in a game. Like they learn a whole lot of different movements that they might not feel confident to do in the more formal setting.
Just quickly, it reminds me of, we had Ken Martell from USA Hockey out a couple of years ago, and he had this really neat video he showed, and for the viewers, I'll put it in the postscript. He talked about this is hockey. And he showed this amazing goal this ice hockey player scored, where basically he was falling over and tumbling and managed to shoot at the same time. And the point he made was, like, you don't get coached to do that, right? So the only way from a skill perspective that he had been able to learn to be able to do that would have been through play environments and potentially some other kind of sports, but in particular play.
We talk about that a lot when I'm working with my students around constraints and around skill acquisition. We talk about that idea that everyone is different. We're all very different. We're all built very differently. And there's no one right way to do a movement, if you like. I mean, there's biomechanical efficiencies and other things that might come into it, but ultimately solving the problem or solving the movement problem is the key, if you get what I mean. And so you can't create, in a drill setting, you can't create that environment, you know what I mean? So it's that play, it's that muck around, it's that trying all sorts of different things that help an athlete develop all of those different movement patterns.
I'll ask it through two lenses for both parents and coaches, purely from a skill perspective. Are there some good principles for them in terms of thinking about play? I'll kick it off. One thing that this is bringing forward to me is the fact that, like, as a coach, there is no way that coaches are going to be able to necessarily support all the movement problems that their athlete might have to face one day. And actually, just by being exposed to more play opportunities, the fountain of knowledge that's supporting their ability to solve movement problems is able to grow more so than what the sum of coaches would ever be able to teach. So I think that's one thing that I think is quite neat in terms of why coaches should think about enabling play or the messaging around play, particularly back to parents. Are there any other key things in terms of takeaways or messages?
Yeah, I mean, we can't go past obviously really knowing your athletes as well, because I mean, it's important that you understand where they're all coming from in their space. But yeah, the things you allude to around that play, and you're never going to be able to create environments that have to solve all of those problems. So we talk about this idea of becoming really good designers of opportunities or designers of activities, and as coaches, where you're sort of creating environments or problems and where those things happen and they have to solve them. So you're creating these athletes that will solve the movement problems in a dynamic range of situations, which makes them therefore far more adaptable when they come onto the field, and they're not looking to the coach to be told what to do. They've got that ability to respond to the environment around them, that they've solved the problem themselves. We link back to some of those notions of autonomy and decision-making and self-awareness. And I mean, we think about the New Zealand coach approach, which has been around for quite a while now, but it's underpinned by some of those concepts. So the more we can facilitate that sort of stuff in our coaching environments, the better.
So there's some key tactical takeaways in this space that parents and coaches should be thinking about?
Yeah, key takeaways probably from what I've experienced or what I've seen is one is to allow those play opportunities. I suppose that's a big thing, is to allow them to do the muck around, to give them the capacity to have that muck around stuff. It's probably a really big one. The other side is the supportive thing. And if we're talking about coaches, it comes back to that support stuff, which we've talked about quite a bit. I mean, they're a really big part of the athlete's environment as well. They're a really big part of that climate, if you like, that surrounds an athlete. So we've talked about parents and we've talked about them letting their kids play, but coaches have a massive impact as well. So being aware of your impact, I suppose, as a coach, and sometimes coach and parent is the same thing, which is an interesting discussion in itself. But yeah, to come back to the research for that take home, what I am always really aware of is that the athletes that I spoke to, they made it to the top, but by and large, they all had really awesome coaching experiences. They had really positive experiences with coaches that were really positive, with lots of positive reinforcement, and gave them opportunity, whether that was from the little things they said to them right through to the more, we're going to make this happen for you. That coach had a real massive impact. So I suppose that's probably a take home as well, is to understand your power as a coach.
Yeah, with great power comes great responsibility.
Well, yeah, it does. It's a hard one. I alluded to the notion of the parent and the coach being the same person, because in our youth sport that happens so often as well. There's the double-edged sword to that as well, in the sense that how do you be a parent and a coach, and how do you support those children through those things while supporting everyone else as well? Do you know what I mean? But that's
a whole separate Q&A.
It is, eh?
Yeah. I'll segue from here. You talked about it earlier. I can't remember that you used a really neat word, but thinking about the a combination of how all these experiences are inseparable, and then thinking about the athlete journey. And I think we need to caveat that you're looking retrospectively at elite athletes and their journeys, and everyone's journeys are different. I think that's probably one of the key take homes. And I only put that out to contrast that often when we're wanting to forecast, whether we want to forecast how children will progress athletically or otherwise through sport, often it's neat and linear, but in reality that's not the fact. And only in hindsight can we at times make sense of this. But when you're right in the valleys or at the top of the hill, you don't often see the ups and downs for what they are. So I'm keen to talk a little bit about that and the sense of athlete journeys, and perhaps critique a little bit the concept of pathways. I know pathways is a word that gets thrown around a little bit, and to me there's an inherent limitation with when we talk about pathways, because it does paint a sense that something's going to be linear. But let's talk about this concept of athlete journeys, and probably what do parents really need to be mindful of? And I appreciate this is so hard, because when you're in the weeds, as you said, sometimes you can't see the forest from the trees.
I'll share a slide that goes with this a little bit as well, because it's probably quite an important element of that. But the journeys thing's a tricky one, and the pathway word is you're right. It has a lot of connotations with it around pathways. And I suppose to throw in there something that's not really explicit in the journal article, but something that was quite interesting when I was talking to the athletes was that they didn't really understand or know what their pathway was going to be a black stick when they started playing hockey. They just did it for fun. They did it because they enjoyed playing hockey. It wasn't because they could see the pathway to being a black stick, if that makes any sense. So that might be quite important.
Yeah, and I think that's neat. There's almost like a whole heap of sliding doors moments, right? But there's some things that both the support network and the athletes can do to stack the deck in their favour, if that's a pursuit that they're interested in carrying on.
And quite often what these guys did was they played sport for fun, and by default, because they were successful, they had that snowball effect, if you like. So it sort of had that element to it. But I jump on a little bit what you're saying around every athlete's journey is so unique and so different. I suppose key things or things that came out of this research that I'll probably talk to, and that's where this slide comes from, is this slide essentially illustrates, it's a bit of a capture of the sporting pathway or sporting timeline of one of the participants. By and large, the majority reflected a similar idea. As you can see, it sort of kind of captures that whole pathway from early into sport right through to when they were sort of talking about being a black stick. By default, that's what happened with our discussion. I mean, I went into the interviews in a semi-structured approach and said, tell me about your sports experiences. And some of them, they did have some questions beforehand, because I know asking 20-plus-year-olds or 30-year-olds about their experiences when they're 5 can be challenging. So they had some time to prepare. But by and large, I got all these stories about how they became, or what sports they played growing up. And what this reflects is a really high level of sampling lots of different things. And so we've got those notions of sampling and diversification, if you like, versus specializing. I know those terms have been thrown around a bit, and within the Balance is Better stuff that we're obviously talking to, those are one of those concepts, and that notion of is specializing really necessary. And I suppose by and large what this research shows is that there is a different way, that there is a different pathway to that elite status. So eight people were interviewed, and 7 out of the 8 illustrated a sampling pathway, if you like, or they played lots of sports along the way. So I suppose one big take home from that is that yeah, it is a pathway that works. It's something that these guys were successful from. If I may, I was just wondering whether there's quite an interesting quote from one of the athletes that I could read now. So it's around that diverse notion, and one of the participants, one of them sort of alluded to their perception of that. I think it's so good that I was able to play so many different sports. I came in fresh, loving it, and I wasn't just drilled. I just got to play lots of different sports, have fun. Obviously, I was competitive, but I got to find out what my favorite sport was by default, by experimenting with other sports. I didn't just get chucked into one and get told to train every day for that one sport. And then she went on to say that, yeah, you do see a lot of kids blow out because they just go in too young and they don't do anything else. That's all they have. So it sort of captures probably that discussion point, if you like, around the sampling versus specializing and the perceived benefits or what this athlete in particular saw coming from it. So that in itself might give some take homes.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that this makes me think about, particularly for parents, is often we think about, like, when we talk about early specialization, we think about the Tiger Woods and the Earl Woods story, right? And Earl Woods saying, like, basically setting Tiger up to early specialize from a really early age, and that being like there was an explicit decision there. And I don't think very many parents, particularly in New Zealand, actually make an explicit decision to go, actually, I want Johnny or I want Sarah to be a pro basketballer. Or even if actually they really enjoy this, I'm going to support them all they can to just hone in and focus in on this. To me, it's almost like the putting a frog in water that's not boiling, and then it just suddenly starts boiling. And what happens is you can see how, perhaps caught up is the wrong word, but parents support decisions or enable decisions around a young person who's an athlete with potential, where there's a whole heap of other environmental things going on, and it's like, hey, you need to do, if you want to get to this next step, you need to also do this program and this program. And then there's opportunity costs, because actually you need to do so much football, you need to do so much basketball, perhaps from like an earlier age, apparently, because you know what, my son or daughter actually is showing potential at this age and stage, is interested in like progressing. And I can see how, like, as a parent, you're like, that's the right thing to do. I only want to do my best by them. Is like, well, if my wallet enables it, I'm going to pay for them to be able to do the extra programming and we'll call it the academy stuff. And then suddenly, as I start going back to like the boiling water analogy, is like, sorry, the frog in boiling water is you don't really, it grows on you, but you don't really see how. I think about it as like a pie, how suddenly the variety of activity within the hours within a week is all encompassed around, let's say, a certain type of sport, and it's particularly formal. I think, that to me, it's a little bit more nuanced than just like, as I said, the Earl Woods story, right? It's like there's a whole heap of other complex things that go around. And by no means, I don't think parents are always the ones necessarily explicitly making the decisions. They're probably the ones that just are signing it off, particularly if they're paying for it, because their son or daughter's like, actually, I want to do this, and they're like, well, I can't say no to that. And that reminds me, there's an interesting, a colleague of mine used to share an anecdote. He said, well, you know what if your kid wants ice cream, that's fine, but if they want ice cream for breakfast, lunch and dinner every day of the week, like, what are you going to say? And sometimes it's really hard as a parent, because actually we know all the good stuff that comes out of sport. So it's really hard to, like, where do I become the pulley parent to go, like, actually, if I need to think about the long game here and what's best for my child, perhaps there is a hard conversation at times, not always, at times, to be like, actually, do we need to change here? And I don't know, it's so complex and so different for everyone, right? Like, I actually think I've heard some people make the argument, and I think it's a very valid argument, that actually, as a kid, I was all in on basketball, but the type of activity I did in basketball was so varied. And so to me, it's not always as black and white as saying, oh, you need to play lots of different sports. It's the actual variety of the movement, the variety of the context, and the people you get surrounded by. But anyway, sorry, I went off a bit of a rant there, but
No, it's got just to jump in on that. Like, I think that's a really valid point. That last one as well, around the variety. Like, sometimes it's not so much about how much time you spend doing something, it's what you're doing during that time. And I suppose if you think about play, you think about those other things that are happening, like that, it's the balance, isn't it? I mean, that's the word we throw around a lot, but what does that look like? And yeah, I mean, as a parent, you can completely appreciate that. Like, we all just want the best for our kids, but we are one factor in this huge beast of an environment that exists around us. And yeah, your examples are exactly that. Like, it's really not that easy as a parent. And I mean, I think we talked about this a little bit the other day, Hamish, around like from that high level, who are all the stakeholders that are involved in this experience? Like, right from the big ships that make Sport New Zealand, for example, that make some big decisions around how the sports look from that higher top end. But then as a parent, you've got Jimmy who wants to play basketball all the time. And there's a real difference in how you have to deal with that.
Yeah. And I think just to jump on that, I think that's super important, is that depending on where you stand affects what you see, right? And particularly the diversification message, or the variety message, or the sampling message, which is all within the same boat. If you're an administrator, to me, it makes you think about, well, how do the structures that I provide my participants either incentivize them or disincentivize them to do more of the same stuff? And is that a good thing or not a bad thing? Whereas if you're a parent, actually, you're making a completely different decision in a way, because it's actually, you're dealing with individuals around like what's best for the specific individual, not generally best for a population as a mass. And there's a whole host of other things, like maybe Johnny does need to do more basketball because the alternative is he's getting into trouble in the streets. So it's like, it's really complex. But I think all I can probably state here is for parents and administrators, and wherever they're needing to make decisions, and sometimes they don't even realize they're making decisions, but it's just that, and this information is really supportive to having a higher level of awareness around, like, well, what are some of the other things I need to factor in and consider. It is a challenging one. I mean, as we started this whole discussion today, like, we by no means are we experts. We're really just trying to have a discussion around this from multiple perspectives. I mean, I've talked to a few elite athletes about their pathways to get to that sport, and as we said before, they were successful in getting there. But so we're looking retrospectively at these guys that made it, and these were the experiences they had along the way. But I think you've got to look at probably the important things, and the important things around the athlete. It's all got to be athlete centered, and around that notion of, are they enjoying what they're doing? Are they having fun with what they're doing? Because those are the factors, if you think by and large, and again, this is what comes out of this piece of research, is those motivating factors. Like, they were having fun and they enjoyed it. And so everybody, we know that fun can be defined in so many different ways by so many different people. We know that. What does enjoyment mean for people? And it means different things for everybody as well. But at the end of the day, if somebody's enjoying and having fun with stuff, there's a high chance that they're going to continue to do that thing. And I mean, if we think long game, we think bigger picture, what are we trying to achieve? What do we want our kids to be doing in the long run? Do we want them to be fit and healthy and engaged with sport for life, like, or do you know what's our end game? Yeah, that's a super interesting question, right? So, and I think something important we bring up now, because probably a reflection I've had, is the conversation has been tilted more towards thinking about how do we support the best athlete in terms of their athletic development. But sport is so much more than that, and success in sport to me isn't just about having the skills and talent to be able to stand on the dais at the Olympics. Actually, success in sport to me also looks like I've gotten all these kind of valuable, wider, holistic abilities and skills and learning from sport, which can be applied to elsewhere. Success in sport looks to me is like the fact that, although I still feel very broken every now and again, I'm happy enough to run around the football field in my 30s. Like, I think about so many kids I played football with at school who were more talented, and to me it seemed like they enjoyed it, but for one reason or another don't play football anymore, right? So
and those are those questions, like, what does a successful athlete look like? Are they the guy that's at the top, or are they the guy that stays at the top for a while? Are they the guy that's got all that holistic happy and they're happy at the top? You know what I mean? Like, there's there's all those sorts of elements that come with it. And it's probably to build on that, and that's where a lot of the other stuff we've discussed today sort of maybe comes in. Like, is there an element of that risky real play and that unstructured play that helps an athlete develop more holistically, that helps them be more responsible, helps them make better decisions, helps them, you know what I mean, have a bit more of an awareness around themselves? Like, is there a supportive environment that allows these athletes to flourish? And what do we do in that supportive environment to help that happen?
And I think that's a real key word, right? Like that sense of flourish is a word. I think that's a really, not that I'm qualified to provide advice, but if there was a take home for parents, is like, just keep that word flourish in center in terms of thinking about, like, how am I parenting, or what does my support look like? And I think sport is a vehicle for many, but if you keep that holistic sense around what does flourishing look like, and how are these activities and environments supporting my child to flourish, I think you can't go too far wrong. And just to circle back, I know we're getting a little bit philosophical here, so I'm mindful. I don't want to turn everyone off who's watching, but I think it's really important as a parent to ask yourself, there's some key different lenses for why we want to support our children to play sport and why children want to play sport. But as a parent, why do you want to support children to play sport? And it's fine to say, I want to see my child be successful in sport purely for a sporting sense. But actually, when you ask parents, they often talk about, well, because they get all these other things around, like being exposed to teamwork and team building and communication skills, et cetera, and social skills, and also because it keeps them physically active. And we know there's a whole host of wellbeing outcomes. And probably one of the key things, and by and large, most parents are really good about this, but just making sure that you keep those things in kilt in terms of you don't get too consumed, and it's pretty easy to do to the winning and I want to see success by, let's call it a traditional means in sport, personal or team success in competitions, etc. Because I think too often you can see that becomes consuming or all-consuming, and then you lose sight of the other reasons and the other whys. And I think that's probably, if not a challenge, but something perhaps for parents to think about, is just every now and again, just reflecting on that, is how am I keeping the other whys, all the various whys for supporting young people to play sport, for supporting my children to play sport, how am I just keeping them present and at the forefront? And that's probably a really good way to put it, because there is that, and we really quickly can forget those things. And at the end of the day, it's back to those, why do these kids play sport? Why do they want to play sport? And if you can get, and I'm not saying we have the answers and it's the right thing to do, but if you can get those things to happen in those early spaces, then you are hopefully creating this element of an athlete that has a good foundation and some skills that will then help them stay involved and do well in sport as they progress. Thanks, Bobby. I'm mindful we're coming towards the end here, so I'll start steering us to wrapping up. But this has been really interesting. Is there anything else, I guess, out of the research or more generally that you're keen to discuss? And perhaps where I'd be really keen to go from here is trying to make it really tactical and practical for parents or coaches. I know we've talked about a couple of cool take homes, but over to you.
If we're thinking about tactical and practical and those final outcomes, if you like, or things that, I'll just stop sharing that screen actually, so we don't need that for the minute. But I suppose it's the thing to hammer home some of the things that we've talked about a little bit, is trying to embrace play and embrace those things are really important, and to not replace one with the other, and try and let those things happen. Being a supportive parent is quite important, but allowing your athlete to make some of those decisions. But as we've talked about already, Hamish, with what you've just notioned around the ice cream analogy is a really good one, is there is also a responsibility on the parents and on the coaches to facilitate that appropriately and support those kids accordingly. So workloads and balance is probably the key idea, and the key things is to make sure we are balancing all of that stuff. And I liked what you said around the whys, and that remembering why we do this and why the kids play sport, and ultimately why they enjoy what they're doing, and how can we maintain those things, or how can we encourage those things.
Thanks, Bobby. I think just to replay that what you said has made me think about a couple of things. So we often hear the term pushy parents, but the converse concept of that, which we don't hear a lot about, is pulley parents. And there's a couple of articles around like Roger Federer's parents have been typecast as pulley parents, and actually thinking about how did they at times pull Roger back from honing in on tennis too much to make sure his experiences at a younger age were able to stay quite diverse. And then, as you said, to me, if there was a take home for parents is and somehow just make it a ritual, whether it's once a year, just to circle back and reflect on, why do I want to support my young people to play sport? As in, like, what do I want to get out of it? And you know what, being a successful athlete, that's a legitimate like rationale for supporting young people to play sport. But also there's these other things that I'm sure most parents tuning in here would also say, yeah, and two, that's the reason why I want my child to play sport and continue to play sport. So just circling back and making sure that you don't lose sight of all of those. I know, I appreciate it's hard to do because when there's so many things that kind of fly in front of us, and often we don't get the opportunity or the bandwidth to lift up and just have those reflections with ourselves.
I just listening to what you're saying, I'm just wondering whether there was some recommendations that came out of that particular piece of research, and I wonder whether this might be a good time to just.
I think it's a perfect segue to talk about those recommendations.
So, because the words probably, I maybe put it all in context, I suppose, but recommendations that came out of this particular piece of research. So firstly, diverse, largely self-determined and less structured early sports experiences should be encouraged in an effort to develop athletes with a good grounding and that lifelong passion for sport. So we've sort of talked about that a bit. Those unstructured, outdoor, real play sort of elements need to be included and encouraged as much as we can sort of in those developmental practices. But again, we know that's challenging and the environment impacts that. Athlete development need not take the place of those unstructured settings. Athlete development need not place structured sports above the unstructured stuff, because they're all really, really important. And likewise, that sports participation should not be at the expense of the valuable playtime. So trying to balance those things, again, these are just those take-homes that came out of the research. And probably one of the biggest and the final thing is sort of that an athlete cannot be separated from their surrounding environment. And sort of, so as those athlete development concepts, they need to embrace those holistic practices and measures of expertise in order to ensure that we have that sort of sustained success in the long run, ultimately. So,
Awesome. Well, thanks for Bobby. I think that's a great place to wrap up. We'll make sure that we include links in the show notes to both your research and your thesis, and particularly some of the diagrams and illustrations you've shared with us today. And I'm sure if anything else pops up in terms of what you're thinking, or if there was anything else that you're like, oh, I also need to talk about that, we'll make sure that it's included in the show notes as well.
Awesome.
For those that have tuned in, thank you for listening, and we're going to call it there. Until next time, hopefully you guys continue to enjoy your sport for your young people as well as yourself. Cheers.
Awesome. Thanks for listening, guys.